Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to the modern history class. And we are continuing our study and discussion on the topics that are relevant to modern church history. And this is week number 7. 7th week already, and we have discussed some of the development within the church, and that's we'll just review briefly and go to the next topic. Early ecclesiological development, and so in the 20th century particularly, we have seen a new development within the church, and the new forms or new styles of church compared to that something called the traditional or conventional church has been developed. One of those trends is like a Pentecostal church and charismatic churches become more flourishing, more popular among the certain group of Christians. And then we have a development of ethnic churches, especially the national churches, which are non-Western. And also we have a movement within the European and Western church, and some of them are example like a new emerging church movement. And then we see mega church, the numbers of congregation more than 10,000, 20,000, so on. And some of the churches, a larger church for example, in Korea, the Full Gospel Church in Yeouido, Seoul, they maximum number was like a 600,000, more than 500,000 members. And then we have recently this micro church movement as well, compared to, in contrast to the mega church movement. Then we talked about cell churches, those smaller unit of churches, which is more like oriented toward the model that we find in the New Testament, in the book of Acts. So first churches are, all those churches are like the cell churches, and they are house churches. House churches are the churches that are meeting in a just regular resident home, rather than a sanctuary or the institutional church buildings. And we see many of these house churches in China, mainland China. And the reason, there are a couple of reasons. One of the probably the primary reason is because of the persecution that's against the non-government churches. So people are meeting in a house more like in secrecy, and so house churches become very popular in China and in also North Korea, and especially in North Korea we call something called underground church. Underground church is a cell church, and only the certain true members can join with the secrecy. So because of the nature of the underground church, they tend to be cell churches and house churches. See, these developments, churches being illegal and churches being targeted, happened within last 100 years or so with the development of communism and socialist states, and then of course in Islam states, being a Christian was not a something that were allowed or legal. So there were some small congregations, but in these Islam countries, I mean, converting into Christianity, usually it means certain death. So the number of Christians in those Islam states are very limited. For example, in the country of Turkey, we have probably less than 1,000, and all the other strong Islamic states, the numbers of Christians are less than 1,000 and less than 100. So you can actually name those believers in those states, and because of the nature of the persecution and church being illegal, the church has to be small. Cell churches, house churches, sometimes it's not a matter of choice, but it's only choice that you have. Then decline of the Western churches is prevalent. I mean, it's obvious. The numbers tells you, and then the number of missionaries sent by Western churches decreased in the last couple decades. So last 20 years, there's a very drastic decrease of numbers of missionaries compared to like a 50, 30 years prior to that. So by the end of 18th century and then 19th century and until the early 20th century, that's the golden age of overseas or foreign mission. So we see, I mean, in modern church history, one significant trend is the decline of Western church and then rise of non-Western churches. And then by the beginning of 21st century, most church growth, the number of believers, new believers, being stagnant for many reasons. So we see that kind of big trend. Then rise of third world churches, non-Western, third world, economically underdeveloped countries, we see the number of churches increase, and then the number of believers increase. That was the case in most other non-Western countries. For example, in South Korea, the church began to grow in from early 70s, 1970s. The time 1970s were the beginning of economic development, and the South Korea was still considered less developed or underdeveloped or in the process of becoming a developed country. With that economic growth and economic difficulties, church begins to grow. Then it flourishes with the economic growth. Then it reaches certain level of how we say the standard of living or quality life quality, then begins to decrease. Same thing happens with the third world countries today. As they begins to develop as they begin to develop economically, then church begin to grow. Protestant church for in our case. So there's some connection, and then there has been some studies regarding those elements. Anyways, then we see the new development in recent years, in the last couple decades, as church growth becomes stagnant, meaning it plateaus. It doesn't go uphill, but it stays almost the same for many years. As it happens, there's a kind of trend and movement against the institutional church or organized religion, so-called. And there are many reasons regarding this anti-institutional or anti-organizational church movement. One thing is individualism. Not only the Western world, but non-Western world, China, Japan, South Korea, these countries, the worldview is changing rapidly, and as they change their worldviews, they become more individualized. The family is less important. The community is less important than it used to be. And young people, they have kind of negative feelings or attitude against something that's institutionalized. Government, the companies, and then churches, schools. So they have fundamental negative attitude against these institutions, and it goes against the church as well. And also we see newer heresies and cults. And last 100 years, we see many new development of heresies that we have not seen before. So that's a very new trend. Okay, so that was from the last week, and let's see. And now, next topic that we are going to focus and discuss will be the theological development. Theological development. Theology, it's a fundamental academic discipline. I think we did cover this part. And then there is a theology proper, and that's theology in larger as a whole. Theology proper, because theos, word theos in Greek, it means something of God or divinity or godly. So theology proper means the particular true theology. True theology deals with the entity of divinity, the Godhead, God, Christ, Holy Spirit, and so on. So that would be the theology in proper term. But today, the word theology is used more widely in a broader sense. So when we talk about theology today, it means it has to do, study that is related to Christianity in general. So not only covers the topic of God, but it also covers the topic of salvation and the church and the mission and so on. So these subjects are being covered under the category or the Academy of Theology. So that's theology as a whole today. And theology as an interpretation. Now we'll discuss a little further on this. Any theology, unless you are reading just reading the Bible, if you don't say anything about what you have read, for example, let's say you're reading Book of Genesis, chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and earth. See, that's a simple sentence. You read it and that's it. And then you understand in your own way. But once I begin to explain what it means, then we have theology there. So theology is a work of interpretation, basically. You try to explain what Bible teaches and what Christianity teaches. But once in the process of doing so, it involves certain perspective, certain academic elements, and then you are going to systemize and you are going to prioritize which is more important, which is less important, which goes up there and which goes under as a subtopics. So topics, subtopics, and the subtopics. So you determine those things. And once you begin to do that, it is a kind of interpretation. So it's no longer a raw material. It's like doing cooking. Let's say you're cooking a fish. Someone catches a fish and sells it to you, and you buy it. And you bring the fish. There's a raw fish. But you cannot eat raw fish. Even the sushi, you have to cut it in a certain way to serve it. So once you begin to use your knife and then your hands, and you cut it, and you may steam it, you want to fry it, you want to boil it, or whatever you do. And then you put certain ingredients, add some ingredients. And it is, theology is like a cooking. You're talking about God, belief, and Christ, and so on. But in the process, you're adding and you're doing some works on the raw material. So that's what the theology is. And the thing is, the theology, it changes from time to time. As the history goes on, it progresses and it relates itself to the time. So, even if you are not a student of theology, or you're not attending a seminary, and as a believer, as you go sit and try to listen to the sermon, the preachings on every Sundays, you are being involved in theology. And the theology today is much different from theology that is in like a 16th century. The Reformers' theology is different from the theology of evangelicals today. The Catholic Church, Catholic theology is different from the theology of Protestants. And the Baptist theology is different from the theology of Presbyterians. So And each individual, for the matter, we have different theology. And me, myself, my theology today is much different from the theology that I had in when I was in 20s and the 30s. So the theology continues to develop and to change. Sometimes it goes back to the something called traditional, conventional, or fundamental, and then sometimes it becomes so radical and liberal. So because it's interpretation, it depends on who is doing the theology. And as people changes, as people change their minds, perspective, and as they get wiser, and the knowledge accumulates, the knowledge of theology, it accumulates just it does with the scientific study. So there is a certain development, maturing of theology as well. And theology is an academic discipline. You teach this subject in the school, and that school particularly contributing or concentrating itself to the study of theology is called seminary. And we know what seminaries are. Okay. Now the importance. The understanding the development of theology in modern church history is important, as much important as the theology itself is important. Here are the reasons why we need to focus on and read the development of theology first. Because when we talk about the church history, we see the events and the people, basically. But what is underlying behind these people who make those actions and the events that comes from the caused by these people, the Christians, it has to do with their theology. So always theology is behind these history. So without knowing the theology, the change and the importance, you will not be able to read the church history properly. So this is why we look at the change, the theological change, the first. And another reason that we need to focus on the development or the history of theology is because there has been so much and so drastic change within the last 100 years or so, compared to what had happened in prior. Except those dark ages in the 6th, 7th century in Europe, and then Reformation in Europe. Probably the major theological change comes in the 20th century. So that's why it is key to understanding modern church history. Number one, the theology, it sets parameters and boundaries. Not only it sets the parameters and the boundaries of the subjects that we need to discuss, and it tells you, the theology tells you who you are, what your belief is, and what your spirituality is, and it makes you distinctive. Without theology, you're not going to be able to distinguish one from the another. Even the so-called core belief, like Godhead, Trinity, and the salvation, virgin birth, some people does not believe that to be true statement or historical facts. And once that happens, there is a certain parameters drawn, boundary. Those who believe in virgin birth and those who does not believe in virgin birth. Those who believe in the authority of the Bible, full authority of the Bible, and there are those who does not really believe in the full authority of the Bible. So this kind of theology kind of draws the line. Of course, the theology has to do with the doctrine. So doctrine A might be quite different from doctrine B. And some believe in doctrine A while the other believe in doctrine B. Sometimes these doctrines contradict one another. So if you believe this doctrine B will be a lie. It's false. And if you believe in doctrine B, then doctrine A is going to become false statement to you. So there is that issue. The theology is saying, okay, it tried to explain what the doctrine A is and what the doctrine B is. So it sets parameters and boundaries. So even though you are not a theologian or not a student of theology, if you are a believer Christian and you do have certain theology, and even if you are not a Christian, those who believe in God or something of supernatural, they have their own theology. So in that sense, theology can be used more broadly in its definition. So theology not only covers the Christianity, but it can be applied to some other religions. For example, if you're a Muslim, you believe in Islamic faith. And Islamic faith also deals with the God, only one God. There's no Trinity. So it separates itself from the Christian belief. Christian belief, 3 gods and 3 gods in one. 1 God in 3, 3 in 1. Which does not make sense. I mean, mathematically it doesn't work. And physiologically it doesn't work. But we believe it to be true. Because it is true. But Islamic faith says that's nonsense. It's blasphemy. Jesus cannot be, he's a human being, 100% human being. They do, Islamic faith also acknowledges Jesus as a prophet, one of the prophets, but does not acknowledge Jesus as Messiah or anything else. Especially Godhead, the equal to God. That's blasphemy. So that's kind of theology that they have. So it's a boundary and it's a systematic explanation. So it explains what we believe, what we, what our faith is like. Because the faith, the belief is very superficial. It's not something that's tangible. So there's more complex and complicated and very systematic explanation is necessary. It is needed. So the theology in that sense is a must. We need to have that theology. Not only it's a systematic explanation, it's a rationale. Rationale means it's a reason. And not just throw a reason, but it's a very reasonable reason. rational reason. So not only it explains, it has to make sense. It has to make sense to those who believe and also those who does not believe. So theology, because of that reason, it needs to explain itself to the others who does not believe. We call that apology, or apologetics. Apologetics is a way of explaining our faith to others in a way that they can also understand it rational way. Even though they may not believe what we believe in the same way we Christians do, but at least we should be able to explain in a very systematic and rational, reasonable way that this is why we believe, how we believe, and what these beliefs are made of and in order of, and so on. So theology provides us with a very explanation and rational, the reason. Then it reflects the context of change. What it means by reflecting the context of change. As you read the theology, as you study theology, you'll see not only the theology, the written theology itself, but you'll see how the people, the mind of people did change from day to day and age to ages. And that's why the theology, the topic theology in modern church history is important. You read the context of change, how the Christianity has developed from 19th century to 20th century and 20th century to 21st century. And the underlying change of the context is the key to understanding those people and events that had happened within last 100 years or so. So this applies to the same applies to the doing a secular history. If you are trying to do secular history, you need to understand the ideology and then the so-called trend, or the mind, or the spirit of the era. These things are more important than the event itself or people themselves. Without being able to read this macro or the bigger picture of history, you're not actually doing the history. So as we do the modern church history, this would be the key to understanding some other topics that we will discuss later on. Continuing with the importance of theology, the theology reveals emphasis and the focus. So when you read and understand the theology, it helps you to see the trend of emphasis and focus, because any human reality, the existence, does have certain focus and emphasis, something that is important in particular given age and time. So when you see these even your personal life, as you look back, there is something that is important, has been important to you in the given time and age and period. When you're young and when you're elementary school, there is something that was important to you. And you focused on probably a game. Then as you become adolescent or teenager, then this gender thing, man and woman, the romantic, these things become probably one major focus in your life. And then as you get older, 20s, early 20s, the job, the work, what kind of job, you're going to do will become important to you. So at the time, the matter of importance and focus would change your behavior, your action, and your decisions, and so on. Same with the history. And the theology tells what was the important issues and the focus on the given time and age of the particular church. Okay, let's take a short break and we'll come back. Okay, let's continue. The importance of theology in understanding church history. Perception of divinity. The main thing in Christian faith, or for the matter any other religion or belief system, is how one understands the divinity or the God figure. And even though the Bible teaches the same God from the beginning to the end, because God is so big, so enormous, so complex, and so beyond our understanding, the perception, how they see and perceive, see and believe God, how they see God, how they picture God, has never been the same. It changes from time to time. It is difficult to call it a development, because even though there's God knowledge about God, Godhead, may accumulate to the certain amount, it never is enough. It's just a little portion. But the Bible tells us everything that we need to believe about God. If biblical God is the true God. And as the time changes, as people changes, as the culture changes, and as the context changes, the reality around the people does change. And people think they are progressing and developing and getting wiser, but the history says no, people does not get wiser. They are pretty much the same from the time of Noah until today. And because of that reason, people does change, and as people does change, they see God differently from this time to that time. So as we do the change of study the change of theology in the last 100 years or plus, we do see how their perception of God or the seeing God has changed. And that's very important in understanding who we are today, right? Then the theology impacts our culture and lifestyle. Our culture and lifestyle, particularly, especially if you're a Christian, your theology does tell you what to believe and how to believe, and also how to live. So the theology is not just something that is done in the classroom, but theology is in your church, it is in your Bible study, it is in your quiet time, it is in your prayer. So theology rules your life as a Christian. So it is key and important to have proper, balanced, well-developed theology. And the matter of fact is, unfortunately, most Christians in church today does not have this basic, or and may have the basic, but they do not have full-blown based, the well-balanced theology, and that creates some problems. Because having a good theology means being a good Christian, and having a good culture, Christian culture, and it means having a good Christian lifestyle. It all has to do with the theology, what you believe, and how you understand and describe and teach and explain your faith. It is all based on theology. So if you understand the theology of the given time and the given church, then you already understood much of the history, why this event happened, why that these people did what, and so on. So the theology is that important in understanding history. Then why then theology changes? If the theology is based on the Bible, and if people has been studying the Bible for at least 2,000 years or so, since the beginning of, let's say, since the beginning of Jesus Christ. Of course, theology was way back there, another 3,000, 4,000 years prior to Jesus, there was theology. Even though they did not call it theology, or they did not have seminaries, but they did have theology. And then it keeps changing, and it's still changing today as I speak. The number one reason is change of perspective. People does change. I mean, your perspective is never the same. It's different from yesterday, and it will be different tomorrow. That much difference. So the perspective, not only individually, as a group, as a local church, your perspective changes as a local church, and your perspective changes as an ethnic church, especially if you're in a diaspora church like us, Korean American church, Chinese American church. These churches have more rapid change of perspective because of the given reality, the context around you, the surroundings. It does change so fast. Not only it changes so fast, there are many different cultural, ethnic elements that are existing around you. That's what the diaspora churches is. So as you continue to interact with the different ethnic groups, ethnic churches, and so on, the perspective changes rapidly. And once your perspective changes, your theology goes along with it. You cannot separate your theology from your everyday living or everyday encounter with other cultures and other people and other history and so on. Then change of people. The most simple change of people, some are born, some are dying today. See, some has been within your life domain, and then they leave. And then you have new people coming into your life. So the change of people, who you live with, who you are together with. As you decide to come to United States, then there's a drastic change of people. Who has been your people, your family, is no longer there. And you have to start anew with a new people. There are more new people than old people that you knew. There are more strange people than the people that was very comforting to you. So these are some of the changes examples. And when you have new people, they bring new perspective, new belief, new ideas, and new lifestyle, and new culture, and new things even. And these things comes with the new people. And when that happens, your life does change. When your life does change, then you come back to your belief. And your belief is constantly challenged by these factors. When new people comes into your life and some old people leaves your life, that means a drastic change in your belief system. So some sustained, some blocked those changes, some try to accommodate those changes, some try to overrule those changes or overcome those changes. So people have different attitude and different ways to deal with these changes. But the thing is, you cannot avoid changes because history the time does go on. The clock ticks every second. And you cannot stop the clock from continuing to go. You cannot stop the time. So the change is inevitable. And the same thing with the theology. If people changes, if the reality changes, if the context changes, if the culture changes, and if you move from one church to another local church, so on. I mean, these things happen in your life, and then your theology has to change. And theology in general also changes. And the thing is, in last 100 years, in church history, the modern church history, there has been very drastic change in people and the perspective, and which brought us the very drastic change in theological perspective or belief, theology itself. Change of paradigm or paradigms is a must. When the people changes and the culture changes and the time goes on, you cannot sustain your paradigms. Paradigms also is constantly challenged, and you need to make a certain adoption and adaptation to. Because you take something in and you take out something or throw away the old belief and so on. And most of all, in your life, what happened is, life is full of problems. I can say that many times, and it will be, every time it will be true. Life is full of problems. And you may face the same problems over and over again, which make it, sometimes make it easier for you to deal with those problems, because it's the same problem and you kind of know how to deal with those problems. And there are problems that you will never learn. Same problems over and over again, and you still cannot figure out how to resolve those problems. And the thing is, what the challenging about life is, you are going to face new problems as you mature and grow and you become more responsible, and the world becomes more complex. Once you move from your own country to America, you're asking for whole bunch of problems. So the change means new problems. It's 100%. I can say 100%. Most changes will bring you new problem or problems. So life is for us, the human beings who has been failed in Eden. As soon as the Adam and Eve ate of that fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, see, that's very significant. The knowledge of good and evil. Once you make that decision and eat of the fruit, then you have to face good and evil. Not only just the good, but evil as well. So evil, much of the evil it appears in the form of problems. And you have to solve it, resolve it, and you have to answer these problems. Because many of the problems, it comes in the form of questions. Questions usually, it brings you some doubt. In the belief system, in the faith, in Christianity, Christian faith, the doubt is a major enemy, as well as it's a major, it's a proper, it's protagonistic and also antagonistic, meaning it is all against and it is for us. So doubt, you have to doubt. It is inevitable. You cannot avoid inevitable. You cannot avoid to doubt, to grow and mature in your belief and faith. So question and the doubt, the problems lead you to questions and it leads you to doubt. And your job as a believer is trying to answer those questions. Many of the theology, the work of theology, or the major task of theology, is trying to answer those questions. Some of them are very fundamental questions. Some of them are very little, tiny, but tiny does not mean it's not important. Those tiny issues in your belief system. Not only it happens, the change of problems happen in your life, but it happens to the nation, it happens to the culture, it happens to the whole globe. For example, we need to have a theology about the global climate change or global warming. What is the answer? What does God say? Or what does the Bible say about the climate change? One thing we know, it's been prophesied. It's in the book of Revelation. It is already written that this thing's going to happen. And the Bible says it's a sign of something. So the global warming theology says it's a sign of the age, sign of something that is coming. But as a church, pursuing the kingdom of God, the peace and stability for the all human generation, not just Christians, for all human generation, we need to do, as a church, need to do something about global change. We cannot just sit and face destruction. So that's what the theology says. So these new changes, new problems, new questions the theology try to bring the new answers. Something that you have not thought of. In 20th century, early 20th century, in the beginning of 20th century, there was no global warming. They did not know, even though it's happening. Now the science says there is a global warming and it's gonna go worse. It's a new problem, new issue, and now we need to answer that. The historical background. See, the change of theology, or the recent development in modern theology in 20th and early 21st century, it has to do with something that happened way back, especially after the Reformation. So what we're seeing today is just in the theology, the history of theology did not happen just like that, overnight. It does have its root way back at like 300-400 years back. So the Reformation is the root of what we see, the change in what we see today. But other than that, that's what happened within the Christian circle and within the church, within the theology itself. But the significant change that we see, the challenge against the conventional or conservative belief, or so-called biblical belief, or Bible-based belief. We may have a different interpretation on these two words, Bible-centered, Bible-based. But what I mean is what the Bible teaches. You see, many Christian believers believe Bible to be the only and the true authority about our belief and our life as a Christian. See, that's the common statement for so-called evangelical believers. So I label myself as an evangelical believer who believe in the Bible. Bible is the only authority on our faith, our belief. But there has been challenges against this kind of belief. And they call themselves Christians. And they say Bible might be a authority, not the authority, a authority. And some of the things in the Bible, we don't think is true. See, once that happens, it's a big challenge against Christian faith. And it goes back to what we call enlightenment, which is also a result of Reformation. And then rationalism is also a result of Reformation. As a church Protestants try to separate themselves from the Vatican or the Roman Catholic Church, which they believed to be irrational and very darkened. The church was dark, and they did not have the knowledge or concern, the wisdom. That's why the Protestants protested against the Catholic Church, irrationally. Because of that, the idea of being enlightened as a human being and becoming rational, using the knowledge and the intellect to understand God from the Bible, and you do not rely on someone else's teaching and the dogma and the false teaching and manipulation. We want to do away with that. That's what the Reformation is about. And that idea behind the Reformation took its right or this direction a little different and went outside the religion. And it becomes so-called Enlightenment, rationalism, and the Renaissance. So the Renaissance in the 17th, 18th century, that's more rooted in the Reformation, actually. And then we see the Romanticism of 19th century. Romanticism, on the contrary to the rationalism, it more relies on the music and arts and then feelings and the love and that elements, which the religion at the time, even the Reformation, did not deal with or try to avoid itself or distance itself from these ideas of something that's emotional and man and woman, love and sex. These things are also part of human nature and human being. And the religion said it is bad. It is something that you don't talk about. So because of that, those who are on the other side, who were enlightened, who begin to see the value of this emotions and romantic, the feelings, they become a kind of culture. It becomes a culture, and it becomes a romanticism. And then arts and music and dramas, the play, and these things begins to develop. And as it develops, it distance itself and separate itself from the church. Because church did not like that idea. And church even accused those things as secular. See, even with the Reformation, this dichotic to dividing the secular and the sacred, it becomes more deep. And that happens with the theology as well. So theology experiences more deep division, trying to divide what is secular and what is sacred. And it does not go with the Bible. So as it happens, there are some Christians who is trying to see the religion from the outside of church, outside of so-called traditional belief. And because of that, the church begins to experience something new. Then age of science. And Charles Darwin as one of the key figure in the understanding this, the so-called age of science. Science is a part of human nature. And we ask questions. We like to know. We desire to have the knowledge and understanding. Because once you know what the reality is like, that means you are able to handle and control that reality better. So that's what the science is basically about. It's about the survival. See, that comes to what we are experiencing today. We have COVID-19, the virus. And it's a matter of survival. The science helps us to survive. The medicine, medical technology, and the biological technology, all these things are the science, and it is there to help us to survive. Now the age of science, as the Enlightenment and rationalism and Renaissance takes off, so the scientific development in 19th and 20th century is much, several thousand times than the scientific development in the past centuries. So there is very rapid and fast development of science and technology as well, which result in Industrial Revolution. What Industrial Revolution does is the creation of so-called middle class. And the things that were not available for the many becomes available as a result of the Industrial Revolution. And also things become much cheaper because it's easier to produce and it is cheaper to produce. And the one thing that the Industrial Revolution does is it begins to destroy the nature and earth. See, that's where we begun. This global warming began there in the 18th century and on. It starts in England and it comes to America, and then it becomes global. And another thing that Industrial Revolution does for human generation, the globally, is people become materialistic. Because when the material is not so available, most people, 90% or plus people, does live without material. And but when things become cheaper and when things become more available, when these things become affordable, meaning that you can buy it, you can have it. For example, cars. First car was much expensive, more expensive than today. Today, cars are, if you say $30,000, most people earn that much money in a few months or a year or so. And you can afford or you can buy a car with a payment. That was not possible. So the things become available, people can possess and have things readily, easily than before. When that happens, people are working to get things. That means people in their mind, the eating and survival is already the thing of the past. And they want to accumulate wealth. They want to become rich. They want to buy more. They want to have something that is better. See, the mind changes very rapidly. You don't need to educate people to do so, or you don't need to manipulate people to become more thing oriented. It happens natural. So the world become materialistic, and as it becomes materialistic, the theology has to deal with that problem, that issue. So the change in the theology and the change of the church is inevitable. It's a must. And the problem is, some of the things the church did not make it itself appropriate or were not effective in dealing with these problems, new issues. So as we study the modern church history, we want to see what was the weak spot, what was that we were not doing right, and try to improve. Because the issues and the problems still continue, and we need to deal with it. And the lesson in history is that we need to become a better person, better Christian, and better church in dealing with these changes. Okay. All right. Thank you for listening. And this week number 7, we're gonna conclude, and I will see you guys next week. Thank you again.